Welcome back to CMI Jerusalem Calling, your source for unfiltered Mideast talk radio. I'm your host today. My name is Alison Weir. I'm a former journalist and the executive editor of an organization called If Americans Knew. We focus on giving facts and analysis to the American public, especially the information that you're not getting elsewhere. My guest today will be a longtime journalist, radio host, and Middle East analyst named Jeffrey Blankfort. Jeff is really one of the people who is, I feel, most informed on Israel-Palestine, that has been following this issue for many years, and whose information and analysis has largely not been available to the American public. That's why I'm so pleased to have Jeff on the show today. Jeff, are you with us?
I'm with you.
Start by telling people your background and how you got involved in writing, analyzing, and reporting on the Middle East.
I grew up in a non-Zionist household. My father supported a binational state and was active in the Jewish community in Los Angeles and in Hollywood. He became very disenchanted with the Israelis that he knew, who seemed to be talking out of both sides of their mouth. I was 14 at the time. After Israel became a state, we didn't talk much about it, but then a number of Israeli Jews started coming around our house. They were talking about the treatment that the Palestinian Arabs who remained after the Nakba, after the 1948, the way those Palestinian Arabs were being treated by their fellow Israeli Jews when there would be some kind of an attack by Palestinian, what they call Fedayeen, who had been dispossessed by Israel. There were what they called the equivalent of pogroms against the Arabs in the Galilee, the 150,000 who remained. And for those Israeli Jews, they did not want to live in a racist state. And so it's interesting, although the Holocaust was a very traumatic event for me, as much as it could be for somebody living in California, I never transferred any feeling toward Israel. I had no positive feeling toward Israel, and because everyone who came from Israel spoke negatively about it. I'm speaking about Israeli Jews or Jews who had emigrated there. And so the Middle East was very far from my mind. It was far from the mind of most American Jews, actually, until 1967, when the Six-Day War took place, and there was an atmosphere of triumphalism in the Jewish community in Southern California, which I found really obscene. I didn't know much about the situation between Egypt and the Palestinians in Israel at the time, but there was something very obscene about this triumphalism that was taking place in the Jewish community. But the Vietnam War was going on. I was very much engaged in anti-Vietnam War work. I was also working with photographing the Black Panthers. I was a photographer for Ramparts magazine at the time and other media. I really became engaged with the Palestinian issue. I was living in London in 1970, and I was asked if I wished to go to Lebanon and Jordan and photograph the refugee camps, the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon and Jordan, for a book that was to be published by Liberation News Service, which was an alternative news service during the 60s. And I said that I would, and that the trip transformed me. I spent 4.5 months between Lebanon and Jordan, spent time in the refugee camps, 9 days in a camp called Tel Zatar, which 6 years afterward was the subject to a massacre, which people have forgotten about. Unfortunately for that refugee camp, it was in the Christian section of Beirut. And I left Jordan just before the beginning of Black September, which is another event in history which has been very distorted. My experience in those camps and talking to people who had survived and also people who had been tortured by the Israelis changed my life. And I came back to the States, and since that time I have been doing as much as I can to bring justice to the Palestinians.
Excellent. These are significant events that most Americans haven't heard about. Even people who feel they're well informed on Israel-Palestine know very little about some of the things you just described there. Of course, the reason that most Americans don't know these things as well as they should, even though we get so much reporting about Israel, unlike reporting on parts of the rest of the world where, of course, there's very little, on Israel we think we get a lot. There are usually many news stories on Israel about the conflict, about its relations with other nations, and yet it seems to me, and our media studies that If Americans Knew have documented this, that despite what would seem like ample coverage of Israel, it's missing great swaths of important information about the media. And I know that our subject today is really to discuss media coverage of Israel-Palestine. What's your view? Have the media been giving us the full picture? What have they been leaving out? And I guess especially it'd be interesting to have you discuss why this is happening, significant incidents that you can describe.
Well, my first experience with the media on this issue was reading in the American press, in the Newsweek, I remember, coverage of what I had been seeing in Amman, in Jordan, before Black September. And it was totally distorted. Ironically, however, the coverage that the Israel-Palestine issue received 25, 30 years ago was significantly better than what it receives today. Believe it or not, in 1979, you would see headlines in the Washington Post about Israel bombing Lebanon. And Washington Post was so critical in its news reporting, which was being honest about what Israel was doing, that heads of the Jewish community in Washington, D.C. demanded and were allowed to sit in the Washington Post newsroom to watch the Washington Post reporters and foreign desks do their work. Kind of an unbelievable situation, but this is actually true. If you look at the Washington Post today, it has become literally a mouthpiece for the Likud. What you have also, 25, 30 years ago, you had a number of newspaper columnists as well as editorial writers who felt free to criticize Israel, express their irritation with Israel. But since that time, a number of organizations have developed within the Jewish Zionist community, such as Camera, Honest Reporting, and of course there's the Anti-Defamation League, which are ready to make life miserable for the publisher or editor or any journalist that writes something critical of Israel. And for newspaper publishers and writers, it becomes bad business sense to do so because there's no rewards for telling the truth about Israel in this country. What you get largely are brickbats. And you have columnists now, particularly the New York Times and the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, who not only write virtually Likud propaganda in their columns, but these columns are syndicated and appear in newspapers all over the United States. Whereas columns critical of Israel written in the Israeli press, and not just in Haaretz, but also in Yediot Ahronot, never get published here because they're far more critical of Israel than you find in any of the columnists in the American media.
I've certainly observed that as well. My own experience recently has been with Michigan Radio. It's the local NPR affiliate, the largest NPR affiliate, I believe, in Michigan, based in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan, which has been largely censoring an announcement that we've tried to place on the show. This has been going on really over several months. All we want is a simple announcement that would have the name of our organization in the announcement, If Americans Knew. Management has refused to put that in, and they also refuse to take phone calls about it. I've phoned the station over several weeks, several times a day, trying to reach anyone that will speak to me, and only one time got a phone call back from the director of Michigan Radio, Stephen Schramm, who said, yes, he would consider the announcement. He said he'd give me an answer very soon. I emailed him the 15-second announcement, and I'm still waiting to hear back from him. Welcome back. It's Alison Weir, today's host, and with me today is Jeffrey Blankfort, longtime journalist and analyst on the Middle East and an expert on the media coverage of Israel-Palestine in particular. Just before the break, we were talking about some of the problems I've had with Michigan Radio being basically censoring our announcement. Michigan Radio is the NPR affiliate based at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And I know you have had a number of experiences with radio and had a particular incident having to do with the San Francisco radio station that I thought was quite revealing. Could you sort of describe that now?
Well, I could say back in the early 80s, I was asked, because I had a journalistic background, PR background, to get visiting folks from the Middle East, particularly progressive Israelis, critical of Israeli policy, interviews in the print and TV and radio media. It was very easy to do that in those days. It's impossible today. I was able to get a friend of mine, actually, who had interviewed in Israel. He's today a well-known Israeli director, Sinai Petra, but he was a member of Yesh Gavul, which was the Israeli refusenik group that refused to serve in the Lebanon War in 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon. And I got him to be a guest on the leading morning talk show program in San Francisco. The host was Owen Spann, and he had a 2-hour program. The second hour was a national program. Working through his producer, I got Sinai to be a guest on the program, and he had been stationed on the Israeli-Lebanese border before the war and claimed that the Israelis claimed that the Palestinians were shelling northern Israel was a lie. He was actually stationed there. He saw the truth. And so he was interviewed by Owen Spann, and Owen Spann had no political agenda. He just interviewed a number of people. He was a very popular programmer, the most popular programmer, as I say, in Northern California. During the call-in period, a caller with a very heavy accent said to Spann, "Who's responsible for putting this communist on the air?" And Spann, although he wasn't responsible for it, he says, "I am." And that was the end of the career of Owen Spann. Shortly thereafter, he was replaced by a man named Ron Owens. This is 1984. Ron Owens, who I had experience with previously at the station when I brought an Israeli professor critical of Israel, and he was substituting for Owen Spann. Ron Owens took over the program, and he is an avowed open Zionist. Every year he is MC of the Israel annual celebration ceremonies in San Francisco. This is a classic example of what happens when you cross the line and bring somebody in who tells the truth. Now, there was another programmer in the afternoon there named Jim Eason. I tried to get former General Matti Peled, Israeli general, who was become a very strong advocate of Palestinian state, on the air, and Eason told me that he wouldn't do it. He had an experience with Dr. Alfred Lilienthal, who was one of the earliest anti-Zionist Jews. Lilienthal came on his program. Eason said he had never heard the end of it, and he was not going to ever have any other guest on this subject again. So this is an example of what happens. There was another broadcaster named Colin Edwards. Colin Edwards was a former broadcaster for CBC, Canadian Broadcasting System, experienced journalist. He had a program on a public radio station in San Francisco, KALW, and he decided to do a program on the subject no one wants to talk about here. It's a collaboration between the Zionists and the Nazis in the 30s. It's all well documented. It's documented in Israel. It's been in books and so on. It's not fiction. Well, immediately after he did his program, Quentin Kopp, who was a local politician, a very important politician, now a judge, and the Israeli consul went to the station, to KALW, and forced the progressive general manager, ostensibly progressive general manager, to fire Colin Edwards, and he lost his program.
Just to break in for a minute there.
Sure.
For listeners who don't know, Quentin Kopp, for Jeff and myself, who are from San Francisco, Quentin Kopp was a major San Francisco leader for many years in the San Francisco government, considered a progressive Democrat, etc. And to hear this story about him going to a station to get someone fired because they were giving accurate information about Israel is pretty explosive, pretty important information for people to receive. But anyway, go on, Jeff.
Well, actually, Kopp, during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, Kopp joined something called Volunteers for Israel and went over to serve 2 weeks on an Israeli military base, which ostensibly freed Israeli soldiers to go and do what they were doing in Lebanon.
Wow.
There was a picture of him in the Jewish Bulletin in his Israeli army uniform. Rahm Emanuel did the same thing in 1991, President Obama's chief of staff.
That's right. I did know about that, but I didn't know about Kopp.
When the first delegation of the International Solidarity Movement returned to San Francisco with a number of its members who were Jewish, the Chronicle sent a reporter and a photographer to interview them for 2 hours. This is a human interest story, a local human interest story. And at that particular time, a delegation from the San Francisco Jewish Community Relations Council with Walter Shorenstein, who is the largest owner of commercial property in San Francisco, went to visit the Chronicle publisher and managing editor, both of whom happen to be Jewish. And they accused the Chronicle of having a pro-Palestinian bias, which is a joke, of course. But they were so intimidated, the editor and the managing editor and the publisher of the Chronicle, that they never ran the story on the International Solidarity Movement. And they also killed a story on an organization called Jewish Voice for Peace in Berkeley, with which I have political differences. But even the Jewish Voice for Peace was too much for the Jewish Communications Council to see having any publicity in the Chronicle.
Again, to give a personal similar experience, this is really incredible to hear this about Shorenstein. I had not known his role. It's not surprising, but it's still pretty shocking. I know in my own case, around this same period of time, probably actually a bit earlier, a reporter from the Gannett newspaper chain had contacted me back in about 2001 wanting to do an article about me. This was when we were just starting out If Americans Knew, and it would have been very valuable to have this kind of article telling about what I'd learned and about our new organization and website. This reporter phoned me several times for long interviews. He had me email him the pieces I had written while I was in Gaza and the West Bank in very early 2001. Then he was ready to do the story. So he sent a photographer to my home to take pictures of me that were going to be, with this major feature about me and about If Americans Knew. We realized, we've got to get our website online quickly because this will be an exciting opportunity to have people learn about If Americans Knew. We called up the photographer to find out if she had mailed the photos of me or whether she had FedExed them, to know whether we had a few days' time to finish our website or we only had hours. And she said, no, they wanted them FedExed, so we knew we had to move quickly. Months later, I realized the story had never come out. I contacted the reporter to ask him what had happened, and he said it had been killed by his boss. Now, what's interesting about that is that a year or two later, I saw the same reporter for Gannett News. I saw a byline by him on a very excellent story about Kathy Kelly of Voices in the Wilderness, talking about their actions in Iraq and their very valid criticisms of the U.S. government. So he was able to get that story in that was critical of the United States government, but he was not able to get in the story that told about a group and people who were critical of the Israeli government. I think that tells something about what's going on in terms of really the censorship and the filtering of information specifically about Israel that's even greater than the same kind of filtering that comes with stories about that are critical of U.S. actions.
Well, I'll give you another example. Before Barack Obama met with Netanyahu, he received two letters, one from 76 U.S. senators and the other from 329 members of the House, telling him not to lean on Israel, not to put pressure on Israel. It was not reported.
We're actually just about to stop for a break, and this sounds like an important story. So let's hold it for after the break. We have a few callers on the line, but first I want to hear Jeff's story about the letter to Obama, and then we'll take the first caller after that.
Yes, this was an amazing situation. Netanyahu was supposed to meet with Obama, but Obama was demanding a freeze of the settlements. People may remember that. Netanyahu was forced to postpone a trip to Washington because Obama at that point had a spine. In the interim, before he actually came to meet with Obama, 76 senators led by the great liberal Democrat Chris Dodd, I forget the Republican, I think probably Mitch McConnell, and then 329 and the 330 members of the House sent letters to President Obama telling him essentially not to put pressure on Israel. They were our friend, not mentioning even support for a two-state solution or the settlements. What Obama quickly found out is that he had no one standing behind him. When Mitchell went to try and Hillary Clinton went to try and convince Netanyahu that he should freeze the settlements, Netanyahu knew that Netanyahu was the one calling the tune for the U.S. Congress, not the President of the United States. And when we saw 55 members of Congress, 29 Democrats, 25 Republicans, 30 Democrats, 25 Republicans, Democrats led by the House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer holding a press conference in Jerusalem, taking Netanyahu's position against that of the U.S. president. This is something the newspapers did not widely report. Not only that, not a single American newspaper published a story about the 76 letter from the 76 senators or the 330 members of the House. It was in a Washington Post blog by a guy named Al Kamen, but it was not published in the newspapers. And this is a remarkable story that should have been published. Why wasn't it published? Because the American people, if Americans knew, as you say, as your organization says, they might be a little angry about this, but if they don't know, what are they going to do?
That's right. And I remember a few years ago, there was a letter to the president, this was back under Bush, signed by over 50, and it became close to 100, U.S. former diplomats, telling him that he was taking a step in changing the policy on settlements that was endangering the lives of American diplomats abroad. It was a very powerful letter by a group who do not usually speak in such strong terms. Very, very newsworthy, and yet the New York Times, for example, didn't print a word about it, even though a similar letter only a week or two before by British diplomats about the British government having to do with Iraq did get published. This one by American diplomats having to do with Israel was not reported on by the New York Times.
It's interesting that any diplomat who criticizes Israel and the servant of the Foreign Service is dismissed as an Arabist.
That's right, and we see that the State Department has changed quite a bit in recent years, and a lot of the people who were the real experts on the Middle East are having trouble getting significant jobs in the Middle East. They're being assigned places like India, even though they speak Arabic, they're well-versed in the history and the culture, and they're certainly the best representatives that the United States could have abroad to serve our interests, to learn about what's going on there so that we can come up with really rational policies that would benefit our nation and hopefully the world. And yet people with those skills are now being pushed out increasingly from the State Department.
Well, that began with Clinton.
Maybe we should take a caller.
Yes.
I think we have with us Joaquin from Boston. I don't know if I've said your name right.
Yes, my name is Joachim, and we actually met at the Harvard Law School a few years ago.
That's right. I
forgot exactly what the presentation was. I think it might have been related to the USS Liberty, if you remember that.
Mainly I talk about the media coverage, but I often mention the Liberty since that's been so uncovered by the U.S. media.
You know, this sort of control is multifaceted. My daughter, who was in second grade, actually was indoctrinated about Golda Meir. It amazed me. It's just 3 paragraphs. I can read it to you. Let's meet Golda Meir. Golda's early years were not happy ones. Her people, the Jews, lived in a place where they were not wanted. Little Golda was often hungry, cold, and afraid. She wished that her people had a country of their own. Others felt as Golda did. For years, they worked together to make a safe place for their people. They made the country of Israel. A time came when Israel needed a new leader. They wanted someone steady and strong. They picked Golda Meir. This is a second-grade public school class in Boston. And the fact is, I'm an Eastern Europeanist. This is all crap. And by the way, Golda Meir emigrated to Israel from the United States. So not only is it propaganda, but it's so divergent from reality, I don't even have words that can express my disgust at this.
What we're seeing, what you've just pointed out, is that this kind of filtering and distortion that's in the media, it just seems to permeate our society. I didn't know this about second-grade textbook. That's really extremely disturbing. I know when I went to the local library here where I live in Portland, Oregon, and looked at just picture books about numerous countries. I have some grandchildren now, and I was in the children's section and noticed those picture books about foreign countries. I looked at the ones on Israel, and similarly I found enormous distortion there. You know, misinformation about really what's gone on in the history of Israel-Palestine.
One of the important things, the necessary things for the pro-Israel lobby or pro-Israel segment of the Jewish community to do immediately was to indoctrinate Americans into believing that somehow we had an obligation in this country to support Israel. Getting members of Congress to support Israel requires having constituencies throughout the United States that are willing to let their members of Congress support Israel without question. And so you have a tremendous influence by organizations in the organized Jewish community to get pro-Israel commentaries into textbooks. And I wasn't aware at the second grade level, listening to about Golda Meir, who said there is no such thing as Palestinians. This is the kind of indoctrination that is very difficult to combat because it's going on, and there's a number of organizations that are involved in doing this. Anti-Defamation League is one, very heavily involved, but so is the Jewish women's organization Hadassah. So this indoctrination is very important. This is why an organization like If Americans Knew is important. It's important for people, when they hear the information about what they're not being told about the U.S.-Israel relationship, they get angry.
That's right. I think people are really outraged when they start to learn about the massive amount of significant information we're just not getting about this.
And the caller mentioned the USS Liberty. Most Americans are not aware of the story. It was covered up in the very beginning by Lyndon Johnson. Listeners probably don't know, but President Kennedy was adamantly in support of the right of Palestinian refugees to be returned to Palestine. He supported Resolution 194, which gave the right to the Palestinians to either choose to be repatriated or compensated, but it would be their choice, not Israel's. And this has been kind of written out of history as well. And it wasn't lip service that he was paying to it. The State Department, White House documents that have been declassified show that he was strongly in support of the Palestinians' right to live in their homeland. And Lyndon Johnson came along, and Lyndon Johnson reversed all of Kennedy's policies. He was very pro-Israel, surrounded by Israel lobbyists at every turn, and big funders, I should say. And Lyndon Johnson decided that the lives of the sailors of the USS Liberty and those who have been 34 who have been killed and those who have been wounded was a legitimate sacrifice on the altar of U.S.-Israel friendship.
My name is Alison Weir. My guest is Jeffrey Blankfort. Please go to the website, CNI Online, to learn more about the Council for the National Interest, and go to ifamericans.org to learn more about some of the facts you're not getting and to get the daily news on Israel-Palestine you're not getting from the Washington Post, NPR, or the New York Times. We have several callers, and then, Jeff, it'd be great to talk. I'm glad you brought up the differences between Kennedy and Johnson. Kennedy, of course, was also trying to look into the Israeli nuclear program that Israel has kept secret for many years and now still tries to deny it possesses. But
he was adamant about that.
That's right. Maybe we can get into that. But let's take a call from Alice. I think she's from Philadelphia. Alice, are you on the line?
Thank you both for such a informative and open dialogue. I'm going to refer back to the media and communications. What do you see as a solution to the barriers that you're up against in regards to speaking out and getting the media and radio to accept a balanced dialogue of informing the public about the Middle East situation with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? Why are there such obstacles? And is this due to such protectionism of the Jewish American community? And why is this such a barrier to having freedom of open communications?
Jeff, do you want to start on that?
Well, the first target of propaganda for Israel is the organized Jewish community. There's a number of Jewish publications. Every major city has at least one Jewish publication, and they feed a steady diet of pro-Israel propaganda to their readers. The only Jewish paper in the country that doesn't do it exclusively is the Weekly Forward in New York, which does run articles that are critical of Israel. What happens, unfortunately, is you can get, thanks now to email and telephone banks, but email, if some radio station or a newspaper says something critical of Israel, in no time at all, that station or that newspaper will be besieged with callers and protesters, and sometimes it'll be, in fact, the major newspapers, Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times, have special groups within the organized Jewish community which watch these papers specifically and have websites. The Chronicle, San Francisco the Chronicle as well. And so what's happened is the editors, they may be Jewish or not Jewish. They become gun-shy. It's not a good business practice in terms of the bottom line to take on Israel, to criticize Israel. It wasn't always this way, but these organizations, with each crisis for Israel, for example, after the 1982 war on Lebanon, when Israel was being criticized globally for its onslaught on Lebanon, which took the lives of upwards of 20,000 civilians, 17,000 who were not killed in Sabra and Shatila, but were killed by Israeli bombs and soldiers. Organizations keep developing within the organized Jewish community to protect Israel. After the First Intifada, organizations developed to do that. And so what you have today is a large network of organizations. Many of these organizations have advisors who are members of the U.S. Congress, and they have a lot of clout. And against them is virtually no powerful entity. This Council for National Interest does what it can, but it doesn't have the big bucks. It doesn't have the mass community support, and the Arab American community is no match as well. And so in the Palestine Solidarity Committee, Palestine Solidarity Movement has been largely ineffectual. It's a difficult situation. What needs to happen, ideally, is people to functioning at a local base inform themselves and make it really difficult for their member of Congress to take a position that's contradictory, that opposes U.S. policy in the Middle East, which has been to get Israel out of the occupied territories.
It seems to me that, as I think you're saying, it's really going to require a grassroots movement. It requires everybody that's hearing this program to pass the information on to other people. Tell people about our website, ifamericans.org. Start your own community radio station, etc. Tell people about the Council for the National Interest. It will really require all of us to do this, to start getting the information out to the public. And then the general public, I feel, will eventually counter some of the power of this Israel lobby. We just have a few minutes left. Well, I know there's one more caller I want to get to, Joseph from Berkeley. One of Jeff's areas of expertise, in addition to the media distortion on Israel, is the power of the lobby in really writing and determining our foreign policies in the Middle East. There's been quite a controversy over this among many people. Is it the lobby that's responsible for U.S. policies that are really so dreadful? Or is it, quote, the military-industrial establishment? Is the lobby, the Israel lobby, insignificant? Or does it play a real role? Jeff, do you want to, in 1 minute, try to get to just mention about the lobby, and then we'll get to Joseph from Berkeley?
Actually, to call it a lobby, it's more of a hotel. To quote Stephen Green, who's written a book about this years ago, he said, since Eisenhower, essentially, the Israel and supporters in America have determined the parameters of U.S. policy in the Middle East, and the president can make decisions within those parameters. Every time the Israel lobby has gone up against another major power center in the United States, for example, the chemical companies, the pharmaceutical companies, big agriculture, even the military, invariably the Israel lobby has triumphed. AIPAC has triumphed.
Excellent. We'll have to leave it there and go to our website to read Jeff's excellent articles on this. And Joseph, you have about 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Okay. Yes, I once read a Malcolm X quote about colonialism, which exactly talks about Zionism as colonialism. And Malcolm X said that colonialism is the perpetration that tries to make the wolf look like the lamb and the lamb look like the wolf. My quick question, and Jeff in part addressed it, many people on the left persist in framing the Israel issue as the little tiny tail wagging the big dog, and insist that the little tiny tail couldn't get the big dog to do anything against the big dog's wishes. And I'm wondering what Jeff has to say about that metaphor.
If one looks at the funding of the Democratic Party, by all estimates, 60% of the funding of the Democratic Party comes from major Jewish donors who support Israel. Money talks in American politics. This is evidence for me that the tail is wagging the dog. Tail is wagging the dog. Tail is wagging